Welcome and thank you for coming in such a snowy occasion. My name is Bob Carricker and I'm with the History Department at Gonzaga. And we welcome you to the William L. Davis Lecture, which has been with us at Gonzaga for 40 years. This is probably, in fact it is for certain, the longest running continuous lecture series at Gonzaga. I look through the audience and I see some people who have not been here for 40 years but have been here for a number of our lectures, and so you will know that it is an occasion where the History Department is proud to reflect the interests of Father William L. Davis, who was the longtime chairman of the Gonzaga History Department. He himself spent 40 years as a student and a professor at Gonzaga University. He got his bachelor's degree from Gonzaga and his doctorate from the University of California, Berkeley. Father Davis has set a good standard for the Gonzaga History Department. He was a great teacher, and that is reflected in the large number of his students who went on to graduate programs and became professors or public historians in their own right. Father Davis was also well known as being an indefatigable researcher, and for his efforts on that behalf, particularly his efforts in finding a treasure trove of Father de Smet letters. I think all of us on this campus reflect and know the name Father Peter John de Smet. We have a building named after him. And Father de Smet wrote letters to his parents, and it was the European tradition that the oldest son became the family archivist, and Father Davis in 1961 traced that oldest son of the oldest son of the oldest son to a sheep ranch in Chile in South America, and he managed to bring those letters back to Gonzaga. Father Davis received awards, including the very first Robert Gray Award, which was the award, the highest academic award that can be given by the Washington State Historical Society. So we are always pleased to welcome speakers of good knowledge and high communication to reflect on the ideals of Father Davis. And so introducing our speaker will be Dr. Robert Donnelly, whose most recent book is Dark Rose: Organized Crime and Corruption in Portland.
Well, good evening. It is truly my pleasure to introduce John Fox. He has been the historian at the FBI since 2003. He earned a master's degree in political science at Boston College and a PhD in history at the University of New Hampshire. He is co-author of the book, The FBI, A Centennial History. His articles have appeared in the Journal of Government Information, Studies in Intelligence, the Law Enforcement Executive Forum, and the Journal of Cold War Studies, as well as contributing numerous pieces to the FBI's website. John is frequently a liaison with media, entertainment, and academic communities. He has also appeared in a number of documentaries and participated in television and radio broadcasts about FBI history. Thank you, John, for making this trip, taking your time out, your busy schedule, to travel to Spokane from Washington, D.C. and Maryland to speak to us tonight about the histories of the FBI, the roles of popular, public, and academic history in understanding the Bureau. Please welcome John Fox.
Do I need to turn this one off? Yes, I do. Sorry about that. I'll try not to make any technological mistakes again, but thank you all for coming out tonight. I do appreciate it, and I am very happy to be telling you about the FBI's history. As a historian, of course, I got to celebrate the centennial with the FBI several years ago, so it was a unique experience. But the role that I play, and I'm going to kind of weave it in and out with this somewhat, because there we go. Last technological foible? Maybe. The role that I play really comes between all of the different ways that the FBI's history is talked about. And of course, here in a university setting, in an academic community, we're very familiar with an academic approach to a history. And yet, there are many other people, many other organizations that seek to tell histories of different parts of our life, different parts of our culture across the board. And the FBI, because of its history, the FBI was created in 1908. It was an experiment. At the time, the Attorney General, a man named Charles Bonaparte, you may recognize the name. He was actually Napoleon's grandnephew, so a little ironic, U.S. civil servant, French dictator. There was no, at least ideological relationship, I'll put it that way, I hope. Charles Bonaparte needed detectives, and the FBI was an experiment because at the time the Department of Justice borrowed detectives from different agencies around the government, primarily the Secret Service. So when the FBI was created, it had a very broad mission. It was in charge of investigating federal crimes, and it was in charge of investigating certain national security matters. Treason, not too many cases of treason, Neutrality Act violations, etc. So there were a number, it was broad. Should I move this down so we don't have so much echo? Go this way? We'll try this. Sorry, couldn't deal with the echo. It had very broad authority, but very few responsibilities in many ways. Of course, over time it grew. And with J. Edgar Hoover, of course, taking over in the 1920s, the FBI began to change in many different ways. One of the things that Hoover realized was that the way the FBI is seen had an impact on how it did its job. And so he, of course, as is shown oftentimes, encouraged the FBI to work with a wide variety of media. Now, part of the problem was they tended to work only with those who were very supportive of the FBI, as opposed to focusing more broadly. Things have changed over time, and so we work with a much wider array of people, especially those doing history. So that's what I'm going to be talking about, how over the years the FBI has approached its history, how that history has shown what the FBI does, how it affects the way the FBI works, and where we're at today. And maybe we'll close with a few reflections on where FBI history can go, especially for students who are thinking about research or other approaches to history. So, FBI history. Try not to get back into the feedback zone. FBI history in the 1930s really took off. Told you about how it was created. Hoover takes over in 1924. And sure, how many have seen the movie, J. Edgar? Okay, how many saw Public Enemies? We're talking a couple, okay, a lot more people. So, a couple of portrayals of the FBI in a very key historical moment, the mid-1930s. Hoover takes over in 1924. At the time, the Bureau was largely unknown. A couple hundred people. It had responsibilities around the country. It had been mired in some of the Teapot Dome scandal. It was a political scandal in Washington in the day. Secretary of the Interior was taking bribes to lease out oil lands at the time. So Hoover takes over and begins to change the Bureau. And of course, the story goes that he kicked out the political appointees. He basically increased the requirements for becoming an FBI agent, set up some professional training programs, created an identification division for national collection of fingerprints. So the Bureau starts providing service to other law enforcement, all very much the case. And these reforms had a clear impact on the way the FBI did its job. And yet it remained unknown. In the 1930s, that changed, almost overnight. Lindbergh baby is kidnapped and killed in March 1932. FBI is involved in the case. Gets a little bit of national notice. 1934, the FBI starts going after John Dillinger, and the Justice Department plays up that chase very seriously. Homer Cummings was the Attorney General under Franklin Roosevelt, and he had the idea that in order to deal with the threat of crime on a national level, there had to be this campaign or war on crime. And he brought in publicists to help to deal with this, and some of them worked with the FBI. And Hoover began to learn a couple of lessons. In going after Dillinger, Dillinger was the guy who had style. He was a car thief. He was associated with a bunch of murderers. He robbed a number of banks, and yet the guy had style. When he was arrested, he's shown in this iconic picture with his arm around the district attorney. Cost the district attorney his job, but Dillinger got some notoriety there. Not long after that, he escaped from prison, stole the sheriff's car, took a car across state lines. And that's how the FBI got into going after Dillinger. And so in tackling Dillinger and the other gangsters of the day, all of a sudden the FBI became famous. It made national news. People wanted to start telling its story. Now, this is all kind of current news. We're not really into history yet. The FBI is not looking at itself historically, not considering its history. But it's an important stepping point because it begins to get them working with writers who are trying to tell its story. And in this case, it's the press, but it's also Hollywood. 1935, Jimmy Cagney stars in the movie The G-Men. And all of a sudden, this image of the FBI agent becomes internationally known. Hollywood had a big reach. And so Hoover tended to focus his efforts on Hollywood. And yet history was being done in small bits. The FBI starts a program called the Interesting Case Write-Ups. And they're basically doing short histories of cases to provide to people interested in those specific cases. They do one on the Barker Karpus gang. For instance, it's 60, 70 pages, history of the Barkers and the Alvin Karpus, of their kidnappings, of their final fate, and so forth. These are things that they would hand out to people doing books, movie treatments, press stories, etc. And they kept up the program for years. Around them, more history is going on as well. I mentioned Homer Cummings. Homer Cummings was the Attorney General from 33 to the late 30s. While Attorney General, Homer Cummings co-authored a book on history of the Department of Justice. And so you see an interest in history in the federal government there coming about. Not long after, they bring in a man named Abraham Glassman, who is to begin doing research on how the United States government handled the run-up to World War I. You see, we're fast approaching World War II now, late 1930s. Cummings' book comes out in the mid-1930s. Glassman starts doing his research, 1938 into 1939. The irony being he was also a paid Soviet spy, but nobody knew that at the time. In fact, it wasn't found out until a couple of years ago. But Glassman starts doing some monographs on how the Department of Justice dealt with the run-up to World War I, and the FBI starts doing the same thing. We see that war is coming, and we want to know how are we going to handle it. Now, of course, we're still working with Hollywood. We just had a big spy case in New York, the Rummer-Greibel spy ring, and we completely messed it up. A couple of German agents, the Army had gone and found one of them because he had this great plan that if I pretend to be an Army general in a New York hotel and I need to call up and have someone immediately deliver the East Coast defense plans, they'll bring them to the hotel, I can knock them on the head, and I can take the plans and go back to Germany. It didn't work. He's arrested. He gets turned over to the FBI. The agent who's doing the investigation starts talking to the New York newspapers and says, why don't we do a whole series of stories on this case? And at the same time, he's going around handing out subpoenas saying, well, we want you to come to testify in this espionage case before the grand jury, and you, and you. Well, by the time the grand jury starts to hold its hearings, 13 of the spies have gone back to Germany. It's an embarrassment. So we're kind of learning the ins and outs of this whole, sometimes you talk to the media, sometimes you don't. Some things you do, and some things are better left unsaid. Actually, in intelligence cases, a lot of times it's better to leave a lot of things unsaid, at least in the initial run-up, especially if you want to catch the spies first. So, running into World War II, we're kind of continuing on this growth. 1939 to 1944, the FBI's growth is explosive. We go from 1,200 people in the FBI to 12,000. Huge growth in the Bureau because of wartime responsibilities. And after the war, we're beginning to consider what's coming next. It's obvious that national security concerns are still going to be a serious concern. Hollywood is still interested. In fact, in the closing days of World War II, we worked on a movie called House on 92nd Street. And it's interesting, not so much because it's a historical movie, but because it's based on a historical case. And you start seeing where Hollywood and the FBI diverge to some extent, but it's a case called the Duquesne spy ring case. It was the Duquesne ring was broken just before World War II. The U.S. entered World War II in 41, so summer of 41, it was broken. And what they did was they actually used footage from that case in the movie. They had taken surveillance footage. We had one of the spies was working with us. And so we had set him up in an office, and behind a mirror, they had a television camera, basically. Surveillance technology in that day was a lot bigger than it would be today. And they were taking pictures of the spies meeting. They actually used some of this footage in the movies. So, still working with Hollywood there. During the war, the FBI had also taken on some new responsibilities. Franklin Roosevelt had put the Bureau in charge of intelligence collection in South and Central America. And the FBI created something that it called the Special Intelligence Service, very similar in some ways to a British service, MI6. They were learning a lot from British intelligence about what to do, what an intelligence agency might do. And it was focused on Nazi espionage, Nazi covert operations in South and Central America. After the war, of course, President Truman had other ideas on who should be doing foreign intelligence. He wanted to create a new group called, eventually, the CIA. And so the FBI was going to turn over its operations to this new agency. And one of the things it did, which is interesting, was to actually write a history of the program. And the Special Intelligence Service history, I've got a little quote here, was to provide a complete, usable handbook concerning our entire operations in the SIS field, which could be used as a guidebook in case, basically, the Bureau had to do it again. So it's focusing very much on kind of the recent activities, trying to capture some of that for posterity. Its reflection, though, is kind of limited. But it starts to think some more about it because one of the first critical histories of the Bureau comes out. 1950, a book called The Federal Bureau of Investigation by Max Lowenthal, a friend of President Truman's, comes out. And it is a scathing critique of the first 30 or so years of the FBI, talking about how it grows from basically a conflict with the Secret Service and Congress over the use of detectives into the media empire that Hoover had created by the 1930s. The FBI did not take criticism well. They, of course, immediately create an extensive point-by-point, page-by-page critique of Lowenthal's book that they can condense and actually give to friendly journalists who might want to do something in a negative review form. And so they would spread that around. And they would use it to rebut people who would come in with questions based on Lowenthal's book. About a decade later, another reporter by the name of Fred Cook kind of built on the story, bringing it through some of the early Cold War cases, Alger Hiss and Whittaker Chambers and the Rosenbergs and so forth. And although the Bureau did another critique of Cook's work, it wasn't anywhere near as extensive. In part, they felt they had done their job a few years earlier. And the last book I've got there, the FBI story, was in a sense the FBI's rebuttal. And it was the Bureau's first foray into trying to deal with its history. And it's an interesting one. How should an organization do its history? We didn't have an official historian in the Bureau. We had kind of a public affairs office. Many of those functions were in a group called the Crime Records Division at the time. But they also handled a number of other things. By now, the Top 10 Most Wanted Fugitives program had been created. They handled a lot of other kind of fugitive publicity matters and things like that, and of course, liaison with Hollywood. So what they did was they talked to a reporter named Don Whitehead, respected national reporter. They gave him an office on the first floor of the Department of Justice building, gave him a small group of Bureau employees to do his research, headed by a PhD historian who was in the Crime Records Division. He was a supervisory special agent. And basically, Whitehead laid out the story he wanted to tell. The Bureau did the research, and then Whitehead wrote it up. And they handed this thing out like popcorn. Hoover would sign them, or they'd ghost pen them. Probably need a forensic handwriting analyst to tell the difference, but there were a couple of people who could do Hoover's signature dead on. And so, a lot of those got signed by other people, but they would give them out to anybody. And, Bureau employees could buy up 10, and hand them out to family and friends and so forth, and had a discount rate to some extent. It was a huge hit, led to a movie. So in some ways, I guess Hoover gets his revenge. He actually got a popular Hollywood movie out of the thing, and Max Lowenthal and Fred Cook really didn't have as much circulation, but we did have a better national organization than either of them did. So the FBI story was being told. Now, the book itself, of course, is a all roses, no thorns kind of presentation. So it's certainly not balanced, but neither were the two critiques. And if you put them together, you probably still wouldn't get a balanced picture. But it's a start. People are starting to look at the past of the FBI to wonder, does that past have an impact on the present? Of course, from the FBI's point of view, we argued certainly Hoover's past did, and the reforms that Hoover made had a huge impact on the Bureau, but did we look back even further and consider it? Or did people in the country consider it? The FBI story was at least an attempt to do that. Through the 1960s, more critiques came out about the Bureau. Challenges to Hoover's reputation and to the activities of the Bureau began to accumulate. Through the late 1960s, of course, America itself was having its own internal issues, and the Bureau did not seem up to the job of dealing with it. And you start having people questioning the FBI and how it operates, questioning Hoover especially, because he had now been in office for more than 40 years. If we're talking late 1960s, he'd been in for 43, 44 years. Into the early 1970s, and we have the Nixon administration. And of course, Watergate follows within a couple of weeks of Hoover's death in 1972. And Washington changes. The way people deal with the history of the FBI changes. A couple of things were occurring. First was the passage of the Freedom of Information Act, 1966. Major piece of legislation that had limited impact on the FBI at first. For 10 years, the FBI basically said that our records are compiled for law enforcement and security reasons. They are, in a sense, largely exempt under the Freedom of Information Act disclosure components. We do not have to give up our records. In the early 1970s, that started to get challenged. In 1972, a student group, probably in and around the University of Pennsylvania, broke into one of our resident agencies in Media, Pennsylvania, a small town, and stole a number of FBI documents from there and began leaking them to the press. Some of those documents had a code word named COINTELPRO on them. Stood for counterintelligence programs. It was an effort by the FBI between 1956 and the early 1970s to basically take information it had gathered over time and use it to disrupt groups that were considered threats to the United States. It targeted the Communist Party first because the Communist Party was seen as an adjunct in many ways to the KGB. But by the late 1960s, it had been applied to a small number of other radical groups as well, Black Panthers, SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, some civil rights groups. Things were starting to get out. People wondered what was COINTELPRO. And one reporter started to say, well, why don't I make a Freedom of Information Act request for this information? And as soon as the FBI denied them, they took it to court. Now it's starting to become national news. And it forces the disclosure and a Department of Justice investigation into COINTELPRO. Of course, Watergate happens right around the same time. And so this is all blending together. And the abuses under Watergate and by the Nixon administration that are coming out in the press and in congressional hearings are starting to have an impact. And with the change in political representation in Washington as a result of Watergate, Nixon's party not surprisingly suffering heavy election losses, Nixon being forced to resign, Congress begins to hold oversight hearings. The big one being the Church Committee. Senator Frank Church holds a series of hearings into domestic security investigations within the federal government. Not just looking at the FBI, but looking at CIA, NSA, IRS, Defense Intelligence, Army Intelligence, Post Office, and looking at how these groups used intelligence methods to investigate U.S. persons. And with that, obviously, given the FBI's role, a lot of information began coming out. The Church Committee reveals a number, in a sense, the history of FBI surveillance practices. It reveals the Bureau's investigation of Dr. King and some of the abuses that followed from that. It revealed a series of other programs, and of course, information about COINTELPRO, about opening mail going to the Soviet Union, about other agencies' surveillance practices that had an impact on U.S. persons. And the aftershock of that was in part to create some new laws. Eventually, we get the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act in 1978. We get a rewriting of the Freedom of Information Act so that it is clear that FBI records are not exempt and that the FBI does have to deal with FOIA requests. And we get the creation of intelligence committees within Congress to provide more oversight of the wider intelligence community. This creates an explosion of history about the FBI, because now old FBI records are available. And so we have, coming out of this, a lot of work by people like Ethan Theo Harris, who worked on the Church Committee as one of the researchers. We get David Garrow, who's a professor still writing today, who wrote a good book on the FBI's investigation of Martin Luther King Jr. and used FBI records to look into this. We get Alan Weinstein and eventually Ronald Radosh and Joyce Milton writing about the Hiss case and the Rosenberg case. And some of these books are more supportive of the FBI's position, in the sense, we of course had argued for years that Hiss had been a spy, that the Rosenbergs had been involved in Soviet espionage. And some of the new books were saying, well, actually the FBI looks to have been right. Others, of course, criticized us sharply. Garrow's book on Dr. King shows very much how an investigation that started as a domestic security investigation turned into really a personal vendetta against Dr. King, and how Hoover had actually abused his authority in doing so. So we see all these new things coming out, and of course, the wider culture is reacting to it. The stories that are showing up in TV and in Hollywood are beginning to change. Some of the movies. The old FBI story image is not the same thing. We get critical stories coming out about the FBI. And in the 1970s, along with the rest of the government, public support for the government agencies plummeted post-Watergate. And the FBI was one of those groups that took the biggest hit, because its reputation had been so high for so long, and because the abuses really questioned or helped people to question whether or not the FBI was doing what it was supposed to be doing. So, this is bringing us now towards today, and we are looking at a very different culture in which people understand FBI history. On the academic side, many of the treatments tend to be critical of the Bureau and of its work, or at least questioning whether or not the traditional stories, were as accurate. What was the Bureau's role in the Lindbergh kidnapping? How much conflict was there between New Jersey State Police and New York Police and FBI, and did that have an impact on the case? Some of it is a little more, how should I put it, scandalous. In the early 1990s, we saw a couple of biographies of Hoover had come out at that point. Ethan Theo Harris, who I mentioned, had done one. A reporter named Kurt Gentry had done another. A third did a book called The Secret Life of J. Edgar Hoover, that argued that he had evidence that Hoover was a flamboyant cross-dresser who had basically been blackmailed by the mafia. Now, whatever else Hoover was, obviously, his public image was extremely staid, very conventional, very conservative. And unless you buy, kind of third-hand remembrances from biased sources, the evidence that Hoover was a cross-dresser just doesn't exist. On the other hand, other allegations were made. Over the years, people had questioned Hoover's sexuality. Was he perhaps a closeted homosexual? And the evidence doesn't support a conclusion either way. People who knew him swear no. He was never caught in a situation that would have publicly suggested that he was. But he was single all his life. And people who wanted to suppose that that was true and that that had an impact on his tenure as director did so. people were starting to think of Hoover and the FBI in a way that they hadn't before. What kind of role does that, or impact does that have on the Bureau and the way it does its job? Well, in some ways it's hard to say, because it ends up coming down to what kind of job people thought Hoover did. And that has, of course, changed over time, especially given the investigation of Martin Luther King Jr. If you look at the popular culture, a recent movie about Hoover, Public Enemies, of course, portrayed Hoover as well, or some of the books and other approaches. People are beginning to look at his character and consider how that has an impact on the Bureau. Hoover had taken the lesson that in order for the FBI to do its job, it needs the trust of the American public. They need to know some of what the Bureau does and how it does it. They need to trust the Bureau to do the right thing. And they need to, in a sense, know that they can come forward with information to the Bureau in order to help it do its job. In other words, there's public buy-in to the work of any law enforcement agency. Crimes aren't solved usually as they are on CSI. DNA analysis is not done in 15 minutes. There tends not to be tons of physical evidence at a crime scene that you can use. It usually comes because someone saw something that was odd. Someone knew someone went out and then came back with lots of money, or came back and had blood splatter on their clothes, or someone just wants to get back at someone else and is willing to provide information. And those sorts of leads lead to other information that can build a case. In other words, the public support, the willingness of the public to come forward and help out was crucial. And so from the mid-1930s, Hoover cultivated that public support. Now, he did so in a manner that basically created almost this iconic image of the G-man of the FBI. And that image took a serious beating in the 1970s because the real G-man did not live quite up to the heroic standards of the other. Since then, the FBI continues to work with Hollywood, with TV, with authors, with academics, with journalists, because it is important. In a sense, Hoover was right. If the public buys into what you're doing and is willing to support you, you can do your job better. So the FBI works to create an accurate image, hopefully positive, but we have to recognize when we do make mistakes, through those interactions. Working with Hollywood could be one way. Certainly in my experience, Hollywood is, certainly they're out to tell a story. And that story, certainly as a historian, that story is not always the most accurate. If you look at the movie J. Edgar, for whatever, I'm not a movie reviewer here, so I'm not making comments on the quality of the movie overall. As a work of history, it has some serious issues. Chronology is important. And so, things happen in order, and if you're going to tell the story of a person, and you're saying that something affected their lives, but it happened before that or after that effect occurred, the chronology is off. In the movie J. Edgar, we take a period from about 1919, in actual time, from 1919 to about 1937, and we squish it into about two years worth of movie time. And so Hoover is kind of founding the Bureau, going after Dillinger, and wooing Hollywood all at the same time. It didn't happen in real life like that. So telling the story of the man, J. Edgar, with that kind of truncated timeline, I think is difficult. And of course, it's not the story I would have told. History on TV is another thing. You can get some great, academic history on C-SPAN. But, some of our other cable channels deal with history in a different way. I don't know if you can read it, but it's Nazis are the green, aliens are the kind of light green, ghosts are blue, truckers, lumberjacks, and junkmen are orange, and doomsday prophecies are purple, and the red is everything else that happens. Now, I've done a lot of interviews for shows that everything else happens. I have not done any UFOs, ghost shows. I've done a couple of World War II related ones, so I guess I've done some Nazis. But our public portrayal of the FBI is very mixed. On the one hand, Hollywood can be a big help. You think back to Silence of the Lambs. And a lot of people looked at Jodie Foster's portrayal of Clarice Starling and said, I could see myself being an FBI agent. As far as a recruitment tool goes, it was great. Public Enemies, J. Edgar, we provided assistance where we could so that they could tell an accurate story. Do they always listen to us? No. They certainly don't let historians write the scripts, which is probably a good thing. And certainly looking at my writing, I know it is. But lots of people are writing FBI history. There are a lot of good books coming out, a lot of interesting things, looking at different aspects of it. Anything from popular culture to biography to institutional history. One of the great things about my job is I get to work with a lot of these folks and at least try and help them to find things. I'm a resource for that for many people. Sometimes I'm effective, sometimes I'm not. But at least I get to say, hey, have you thought of this, or have you considered this source, or do you know about this? And sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. You can do that sometimes with some of these other programs too. Journalists sometimes do some very good work. Public Enemies is actually by a journalist, but it is a well-done book on a period between 1933 and 34. Looking closely at the interrelationship among the different gangsters. Historically, it's obviously a lot better than the movie. Although the movie, of course, had some historic elements in it too. And I think actually dramatically it tells a good story too. So a lot of different groups are doing different histories. And when I titled this talk, I kind of thought of it in that vein, that there really are a lot of histories. J. Edgar is in some ways a fictionalized portrait of Hoover. And yet it is a history. And it has some positives as a history, it has some negatives as a history. These books are another approach to doing that history. Some of the stuff that I do as a historian does that as well. It's kind of odd that my position is, not so odd that my position is in the Public Affairs Department, although that has its pluses and minuses. Kind of odd that the unit that I'm a part of is actually in charge of the FBI.gov page. And the reason why I ended up in there is because originally the unit had been called the Research Communications Unit. It was kind of what had been the old Crime Records Division in some ways without the whole fugitive stuff. It is where that, I mentioned the PhD historian who helped Don Whitehead out with his book. His position was there. And so it had eventually come down to this little unit in public affairs that did miscellaneous research on different issues. And it did some publications for the Bureau, the Investigator, which is the employee magazine, and some other things. And eventually it morphed into the unit that's in charge of the FBI.gov page, which ends up being a good platform because I can put out, and I'll show you some of the stats in a minute, but I can put out writings that thousands of people can see, or ultimately millions, but they're not all there to see my writing, which is, no, it's not a shame actually, but certainly understandable. But the position I've ended up with, and in part created, allows me to do a lot of these different things. I get to do some real in-depth archival type research. I get to, have people ask me questions and say, well, I'm going to have to research that and go back and dig into the records and try and figure out what was going on. I get to do a lot of liaison. with other historians, with journalists, with authors writing about the FBI's history. And in a very small handful of cases, I can actually have a positive impact on their work. I get to sometimes work with the media in Hollywood. And that has its pluses and minuses. Not my favorite part of the job necessarily, but it's important because you do want those portrayals of the organization to be accurate. Not necessarily positive. Hopefully the work itself will have enough positives that that's the way the portrayal ends up coming out. But you've got to be able to deal with both the pluses and minuses. And of course, advocating that our records need to be preserved and advocating for the release of those records that can be released. So I end up doing a lot of work to help our records people who are doing the disclosure under the Freedom of Information Act. Talked a little bit about some of the influence that ends up happening. Our webpage reaches millions of people, and a couple times a year we do history stories on that page. So, the history stories can get anywhere from 1,500 people reading them to tens of thousands. But they're out there and they have a small impact over time. The history page itself gets a lot of views, a lot of it from students who are looking for information. We had some tech guys who put together a much more flash-oriented page, so it's got some snazzy graphics and things like that, but there's still some content back there too. And ultimately, the big thing is our vault. It's our new FOIA electronic reading room. And it's where we put up files, old FBI files that have been released under the Freedom of Information Act. And we are finding in the last couple of years that a lot of times these FOIA files are leading to actual news stories. It's how people are starting to learn about the FBI. I was involved in one on our confidential file room. Now, of course, ultimately, for a time, all FBI files are confidential because only a limited number of people can see them. Not all of them are classified. In fact, most of them aren't. Most of the work the FBI does is criminal in nature. And so classification is not necessarily an issue there. The confidential file room was created in the early Cold War because the FBI was beginning to work closely with some of the United States government's most closely held secrets, especially regarding signals intelligence. The interception and decoding and decrypting of Soviet telegrams during World War II and of other intelligence material collected by what is now the NSA or other material collected by the CIA. These materials were very sensitive. If the other side knows that you're reading their messages, they're going to do something to prevent that, and you lose access to that source of information. So this material was to be very closely held. And so a confidential file room was created to basically put it all under really tight control. A couple of years ago, someone made a FOIA request on that confidential file room, and a file of about 700 pages was released. And it detailed all these different materials that had been kept in the room over the years. And all of a sudden, the Boston Globe writes a story about it, and it's on CNN, it's on network news, Wolf Blitzer's calling in wanting to do a show on it. Is it news? Well, obviously it was, but this is all from a little old FOIA release that someone had requested. We just released material on Ted Kennedy, and you get national news. We'll release material on someone else who died more recently in a year or so when it gets around, and it'll make news again. Sometimes people read these files clearly and understand what they're looking at. Sometimes no. And so, I'm in a position where I can try and help them to at least see this clearly so that they can make a good decision on what they want to write about. So our vault is providing some of that ability. Plus, it's giving you a lot of material to write about yourselves. If you're interested in the history of foreign relations, check out the files that we have released on Operation Solo, which was a long-running FBI foreign counterintelligence case. Solo was the code name for two informants that we had in the Communist Party. One was Morris Childs, who in a sense was considered the Secretary of State for the Communist Party of the United States. And the other was his brother, Jack. Jack would get clandestine funds from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union would get tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars to the Communist Party each year to support its operations. And Jack was the one who collected that money and distributed it. Morris, on the other hand, was sent by the Communist Party to meet with communist leaders overseas. Soviet Union, China, Czechoslovakia, Havana. He met with the major Communist Party leaders from those countries, as well as the major leaders. So not just the leaders of the Communist Party, but the leaders of that country overall. He gets to spend an hour and a half with Mao Zedong with just an interpreter. He gets to spend time with Castro. He gets to go over to the Soviet Union right after John F. Kennedy is killed to find out what Soviet leaders are thinking about the assassination. And he's bringing that information back and giving it to the FBI. And there are detailed messages about this now available. We've got hundreds of pages up on the FBI vault that detail this. So you can see some of the thinking that's coming from these leaders, Communist Party leaders, at the height of the Cold War. And how that information is going back to US leaders, because it's going to the president, it's going to the vice president, it's going to the Secretary of State, it's going to the head of the CIA. In one early document, Hoover's marginalia there says something along the lines of, "I don't care how much the CIA director whines about this, we are not telling him who he is." So you can see some of how the FBI is at least trying to protect its source there, and how other agencies are thinking it was a pretty good one. Morris did these overseas missions for the FBI from 1958 to 1978, 79. Finally, they shut it down in 1980. So very long running, we'll have to see. I would like to see what foreign relations historians make of it and whether or not they think it had an impact on US policy. But could be a very fruitful area for some research if someone wanted to go there. So that brings us up to today, looking at some of the different histories of the FBI. What about tomorrow? Where's FBI history going? Well, I guess I could punt and say I'm a historian, so tomorrow doesn't matter. On the other hand, if we look at it, we can certainly see that things are changing. There are going to be a lot more FBI records available. Yeah, there was a big explosion in the 1970s and into the 1980s when all of a sudden from very little to next to nothing, we go to some of the major cases and incidents over the years. Now, though, the FBI has been sending more and more records over to the National Archives. In the 1990s, Congress passed two laws. One was the JFK Records Collection Act, and the other was the Nazi War Crimes Collection Act. And they basically ordered different government agencies to scour their files to make sure that they had collected all of the information about the assassination, all of the information about Nazi war crimes, and sent it to National Archives so that it could be available. And the FBI sent lots and lots of information over. Since then, we have sent even more information over from our closed files. We in a sense really kind of, how should I put it, resisted releasing records under FOIA up through the 1970s. And even beyond that, we really weren't moving towards sending our old records over to National Archives. That has changed recently, and more records are over there now. So certainly up to the 1940s, maybe just almost to the early 1950s. So up at least until the early Cold War now, there is a ton of information available at National Archives, ultimately. And people are going to be able to start mining that. And we'll start having more detailed stories about some of the activities of the Bureau during those days. Are the major outlines of the story going to change? No, I don't think so. But a lot of the details do. And a lot of the richness of the understanding is going to change. So we're going to keep at it, obviously. I think in large part, the FBI has done a lot more good work than bad, but we have to recognize the other. We have a quote up at headquarters, right near my office, by Director Mueller, our current director. It says something along the lines of, the FBI is not going to be judged on just how well it did this investigation or that one, but on how well it balanced that with the protection of those rights and liberties that we all expect as Americans. And ultimately, I think if you look at the Bureau, that in many ways is the story of it. Where we've maintained that balance between successful investigations and honoring rights and liberties, our reputation has been very high. Where we fell down on that balance, it suffered. And that, I think, is going to continue to be the story. So general outlines aren't necessarily going to change, but I think some of the details will. So with that, I thank you for your time and your interest. And I know we have other things going on here. Do you want to conclude, or? You got that one on? I think I got mine off. Nope.
Okay. Yeah, I was just thinking when I was younger here 40 years ago, I used to leap up on the stage, but now I take the steps. It is not the, thanks, Chris. It is not in the format of the Davis Lecture to open to questions, but we do welcome questions, and so what we'll do is, because we are a university and students come first, and students' lives are programmed by 50 to 60-minute increments, we will adjourn, and we have refreshments in the back so that you are welcome to come forward to speak to our presenter. Thank you, John, for an excellent insight into FBI history. So you're welcome to come up and talk to him. You're welcome to go to the rear, get some refreshments, then come up. In either case, we thank you for your coming. We have the refreshments in the back. We have the questions in the front. We thank our speaker, and the meeting is adjourned.